Today we're going to replace the intake manifold gaskets on a 1995 Pontiac Grand AM 3.1 liter V6. Has the typical problem with the intake manifold gaskets leaking antifreeze, running all over the engine, and potentially getting inside the engine and causing severe damage. Alright, let's get started replacing the intake manifold gasket on this 3.1 liter Pontiac. Some of the preliminary things are relieve the fuel pressure. I'll show you how to do that by pushing in on the Schrader valve over here on the fuel rail. Some people will pull the fuel pump relay and start the car till it runs, till it stops. I think it's pretty easy just to push it in over here. We're also going to remove the intake air manifold and hose here. We'll pull these spark plugs back. We're going to drain the antifreeze down to at least a level below the intake manifold here. We'll want to disconnect the negative battery terminal. One of the steps is going to be to remove these accelerator and cruise control cables from this linkage right here. Basically, you move these to the full wide open position. Take a screwdriver and kind of slide that cable up and around. There's a little slot right here where my screwdriver's at. And basically that cable will slip through there. Once you get this thing turned basically 90 degrees down here, pull that cable around and it'll come up through this slot, and this little pin will pull right out at that point. Same thing with the accelerator one over here. If you go ahead and take these accelerator and cruise control cables out of this bracket first, it's a lot easier to twist the wire around and get it to pop out of that slot. To get these throttle cables out of there, you've got to pry back on a little pin here. This one's more obvious. This one here, you can see the little slot down there at the bottom. Basically, you had to push that little pin kind of out of that slot, and then this would pull towards you. This upper one, we're just going to pry back on this, and then it should slide right out. We're going to take this plastic tube, pull it straight up. This goes back and around and eventually goes into the valve cover back there. Just take it all the way out. This is the part that goes into the back valve cover. Sometimes it's kind of hard to get it to plug in there, but get that tube out of the way. Now you've got an intake air temperature sensor. Pull this up, pull back, that'll come out. You've got the idle air controller here. Same thing, kind of pull back on this, pull it out, should come out. Down below it is the throttle position sensor. Same thing, pull that loose. Then over here you've got the EGR valve. In here you've got to reach down below and push in on that little fish hook and then pull up on this. So there's your EGR connector. Just got to push that little fish hook in, then this thing will pull up. With that sensor down in there, I was able to come in from the side, get in there, get underneath it, and pry it up and off. Got the throttle and the cruise control cables disconnected, taken out of the bracket there and tucked away up here. We've got the sensors removed here. Now we're going to take off this intake air filter box and the tube. Once you get these 4 bolts moved up, you can loosen these clamps here and here, the regular screwdriver, then this assembly will come off. Get this out of the way. In this engine you've got cylinders 2, 4, and 6 up in the front by the radiator. and 1, 3, and 5 in the back. I've labeled all the spark plug wires here. I'm going to go ahead and take at least the front ones off and pull the back ones off of the coil. Okay, to drain or relieve the fuel pressure, you want to go over here to the Schrader valve, put some towels or cloth underneath it, take a small screwdriver and depress in on the Schrader valve. I pushed in on it just a minute ago and a little puff came out, not much. So not much pressure in that one, but go ahead and do that. Then put the cap back on so you don't lose it. Here's the EGR valve, and right below it there's a tube with a shield over it, and it goes on down and connects to the exhaust manifold. The manuals say disconnect this pipe at the exhaust manifold. I don't want to do that very bad. I think if we just pull this EGR valve off, that tube will come loose down at the bottom. To get that EGR valve off, there's just 2 bolts, one on each side here. We'll take those off and see what happens. The good news is that below the EGR valve, that pipe does have a flange on it. You can see there's a tube in the middle moving a little bit, and then it appears that this flange down below must have some threads on it, so that pulls it up in there when you tighten it all down. So this tube will just come down a little bit, or we can just wait until we lift this entire intake manifold plenum up and off of there, and it'll clear that tube. The coil's a bit of a challenge. It's got 3 electrical connectors, 2 on this side, 1 on the other. I'm carefully labeling them with little wire marker labels so that I'll get them back in the right spot. There are 2 bolts that hold this coil assembly in up front here. They're easy to get to. Then there's 2 studs in the back with nuts on them. One over here on the passenger side is not too bad to get to. This one over here on the driver's side is hard to see. Another thing that you've got back in here is an evaporator purge canister solenoid valve. It's got 1 port in the back that's not connected to anything. One electrical connector there with a red connector on it, and then there's 2 vacuum lines that connect to it. So that all needs to be disconnected. The solenoid can be pulled out with the coil pack. If your coils don't have the factory numbers on them, it's a good idea to just put some labels on there. It'll help you out. I've got the 3 electrical connectors to the coil module disconnected, 1 on this side and 2 over here. Now just gonna, easy job, get this vacuum line out that goes over to the brake. Got that brake vacuum hose off and just flipped around over there out of the way. Now we're going to work on this manifold air pressure sensor, map sensor. There's a little green clip in the back. I tried to carefully pry it back and it snapped, but you know, it's 20 years old, so that happens. There's bolts down below, but they're hard to get to. I think what you want to do is take these 2 little ones straight out the back, and then probably this thing will lift up out of there. There is a tube that goes into the manifold, and there's a little bitty tube that runs over here to the what appears to be probably the fuel rail. So we'll go ahead and push that broken green connector off the map sensor, and then take an 8mm and remove these 2 screws from the back here. Once you get those 2 little screws out of the map sensor, if you look underneath, there's a little vacuum line that's basically a T. One's going up into the map sensor and one's going into that little plastic tube that went over there to the fuel rail. So just one way or the other, either pull the one out from the very top here, or it'll just pull out of the manifold over here. I just pulled it out of the manifold there, so now just take this little plastic tube loose over here. and your map sensor will come up and out. Store it with the 2 bolts. With that map sensor out of the way, you could easily get to these coil bolts here. The tough ones again are going to be in the back. There's that evaporator purge solenoid down in there that it's got that red electrical connector on it, and it's got 2 vacuum lines. One vacuum line runs up and around, goes over here to the PCV valve. The other vacuum line comes around here, goes up and down below there, and I believe that's the canister is down in there. So let's get those 2 vacuum lines off and that electrical connector off. I've got the bottom hose off. That's the one that goes to the canister. The top hose goes over there to the PCV valve. Working on this electrical connector. Probably can't mess these 2 up, but just in case, bottom one, canister. I was getting ready to disconnect this tube running from the PCV valve back to that evaporator purge solenoid valve. And I noticed right here, this connection's awful loose. I'm thinking at one point that was a tube that went down in there, so that's not good. That's probably letting unfiltered air right into the engine. Might need to go to a junkyard for a new part there. To get this vacuum line out, I'm going to go ahead and take these 2 bolts out, and then down under here there was a nut. Take that nut off, then this bracket will lift up and you can get this out. Okay, once I got that bracket loose, I was able to get this out. It does have a little snout that goes down in there, but it sure seems like there should have been some kind of a grommet or something. I don't know if just the suction pulls it down in there or whether this bracket pushes it tight, but it seemed to be loose. I don't know. Still working on getting this coil pack out of here. Got the hoses disconnected and the wiring disconnected from the evaporator purge solenoid. I can see the nut down there a little bit better, but just to make things exciting, they put a couple of, let's see if I can see them. There's a wiring harness that runs through there, and there is there's the wiring harness that runs through there, and then there's a little plastic connector that holds that wiring harness. There's a little pin that pushes through the plate that's holding the coil pack, so that wiring harness is held to that coil pack plate in 2 locations, one here on the passenger side and then one over on the driver's side as well. So pry those 2 loose out of there. Now with that wiring harness or those 2 clips out of the way, you have pretty good access to that nut. You can barely see it down there in the middle. There's another one over here on the other side. It's kind of hard to see, but pretty easy to get to now. Again, those are nuts on a stud, so you're going to need a deep well socket, and be careful not to lose the nut. Once I got a 13mm deep well socket with an extension on my ratchet, I was able to loosen those 2 nuts, and then with a little bit of contortion action I was able to get my hands down in there, one from this side, one from the other, taking the rest away off and get them out of there without dropping them. Take the front 2 bolts off the coil pack. Those are 10mm. Should pull up and out of there. Got the coil removed. You can see in the back here, this is where those 2 plastic connectors were holding this wiring harness down here. I was a little bit surprised to see that this evaporator purge valve actually is not connected to the bracket for the coil pack, so it stays there on its own. Probably would not have needed to disconnect the electrical connector, but didn't really hurt anything. You can see the wiring harness down here, and there's that plastic connector that's shaking loose. Get a couple new ones, and might be a good idea to get some kind of a protective cover over those wires. I think it's cracked and gotten brittle and faded away over the years. I take back what I said. This purge solenoid valve is not connected to the coil pack, but you do need to bring it up and out of there. And it's just slipped in over those two studs that were holding the back of the coil. So it'll just come up and out of there. This is the evaporator purge solenoid valve. It does say CAN on that bottom pipe. I don't know if you can see that or not, but this would be a great time to replace your spark plugs. Easy to get to the ones in the back. By the alternator here back by the firewall, there's 3 pretty good sized connectors. They seem to be unique, so I don't think you can get them plugged in wrong, but I did mark at least one of the ones that was halfway similar. Go ahead and get those disconnected. It appears those are probably for the fuel injectors, maybe a cam position sensor, and something else. Also note on this vehicle that there is just a plug right here in the upper intake manifold plenum. I was not showing any signs of water in the oil. However, when I look down this hole where the PCV valve used to be, there's some yellow stuff down in there that looks like the beginnings of a problem. Usually by now you would have drained the radiator fluid down to a level below the intake manifold. I still have not drained the fluid yet. I'm going to keep doing everything I can, and then I'm going to get to that. So one thing that's left is the alternator. So we'll work on getting that alternator off, but first we've got to remove that serpentine belt from the alternator. Now eventually we're going to need to take that power steering pump off. Apparently to do that we're going to need to take that motor mount loose, which is going to mean we're going to have to support the engine using a jack with a board on it under the oil pan, and then we may have to put something in the back of the engine to keep it from rocking backwards. We'll get to that later. What I'm about to do next is a step that you don't really have to take, but I'm going to jack the car up, put it on jack stands, get this front passenger side wheel off, pull a couple of plastic shrouds off. That way I can see right into the crankshaft, tensioner, and I can see how the serpentine belt goes around. I just think it'll come in handy eventually. Most cars are going to have a diagram that shows you how that serpentine belt goes around all the pulleys. However, I'd recommend that you create your own diagram that shows it from a bit different perspective. It'll help make more sense. Okay, here's a diagram that shows how that serpentine belt goes around there from a straight-on perspective. That's going to help you out later. I will add a little commentary here that this serpentine belt is a real bear to change. It's one of the only vehicles that I know of where you have to actually pull this motor mount to get the serpentine belt installed. So, if you need a new serpentine belt, now would be a great time to do it, because we're going to be taking that motor mount out here pretty soon. Got the car jacked up on jack stands, got a chock behind the rear wheel. Going to take this cover plate off here. There's just several small screws, and then the only hitch is that they did connect this anti-lock brake line with a couple of clips in here, so you got to disconnect those. A couple of bolts down underneath it, then this whole panel will come off. You'll be able to see the crankshaft and all that in there then. Got that splice shield down. There is just a couple of clips holding on that anti-lock brake cable. They just pop open, pop them out of there. As I have this off, I can now start to see quite a bit of antifreeze that's been dripping. Here's that passenger side motor mount. It's going to be a fun one to take out, but depending on how much we have to take out, there's this little wire clip down there. Just want to pop that loose, and I think eventually we're going to have to take out a couple of bolts to get that whole thing to pop out. And those bolts are right in there. Down here off the transmission there's a T, has a vacuum line that comes off, runs up here, goes into right there. We're going to remove that. We're going to get to the alternator here in a minute. Right now I'm going to work on getting this motor mount off to gain some space here in front of the power steering pump. Now the manual says you're supposed to use special tool so and so, and basically it spans the two strut towers, has an arm that comes up here and bumps on that, and then some chains that come down to the engine to keep it steady. But nobody got time for that, so we're going to put a jack with a block of wood underneath the oil pan and support that motor, and if necessary we're going to attach to these lifting brackets in here, put a chain on them, tie it up to the ceiling if it tends to want to go backwards, or there may be a place in the back where we could jam a block of wood. Typically you'd do that where the alternator's at, but that'll be gone here pretty soon. So anyway, hopefully the block under the oil pan will hold it nice and square and it won't want to go anywhere. Let's get these three top bolts off the motor mount. I'm going to take these three bolts off of the motor mount. I've got a piece of wood shoved in here between the fan and the alternator just in case it wants to go backwards. Got those three bolts out. It looks like it kind of sprung up. I mean, it looks like there's clearance there. It's not like the motor went down, it's more like the mount went up. So I think there's some spring in this rubber right here. So now I think all we've got to do is take off these two bolts in here inside the wheel well, and that entire motor mount will pop out of there. Got those two bolts out from the wheel well, and then this entire motor mount will just lift up and out of the way. Now with that motor mount out of the way, we've exposed some holes there, and I think we're going to be able to get to those power steering pump bolts through those holes. We're going to have to turn it to get to each one. The manual seemed to say that you can get this power steering pump up and out of there without disconnecting the hoses. I'm not so sure about that, but definitely after you take the alternator off you might have a chance at it. So we'll see how that goes. Just as a side note, if you're going to replace your serpentine belt, I believe you've got to take out this little bracket down here, and that'll open up a gap for you to slip the belt in there and then around things. Again, this car was a real bear to replace that serpentine belt, because it's one of the only cars out there where you got to do a lot of work taking this motor mount off to get a serpentine belt in amongst those pulleys. Since at this time I'm not planning to take the serpentine belt completely off, I don't think I have to basically remove that link right there. We've just got to get down in there, relieve tension on that tensioner, get this belt off of some of these pulleys. That's not easy on this car. It's very tight down in there. When you're looking at this from up above, there's a very small window to get a tool down in there to pull the pressure off of that tensioner. I do have a serpentine belt tool, but I think I may have better luck going at it from down below, which is another reason why I want to go ahead and jack this car up and get that front wheel off and those splash plate cover. From down below the car, I was just barely able to squeak that serpentine belt tensioner tool in there, and then I can move that tensioner, get that belt off. I've got the belt off of the alternator pulley, so we're going to start working on getting this alternator out of here. There's definitely a bolt here. There's a bracket up in here. There's another bracket connected off of this manifold that goes on to the back, a little bolt in the back of the alternator. Of course, you've got your plus 12 volt connector. Pull this cover off. There'll be a nut on there. Get that off of there. Then, kind of hidden down underneath, there'll be a connector. I'm probably going to wait till I get the alternator loose, get it turned around to where I can get to that connector and get it off. And then of course remember to put it on first when I put it back in. The good news was I was able to pull that board out of there, and the engine is pretty much stayed put. It's not going anywhere. Got the alternator out. Now we got to just pop this back and pull this clamp off. Just take the time to put the bolt back in, nut in the front. This bolt here with this bracket that goes up to the manifold. This stud back here has a bracket that goes up to the manifold. Get those all in place so you don't lose them or forget where they go. Now what you want to do is kind of feel around with a 13mm socket. Get in through these holes and find a bolt. So far I found two of them, one down here and one sort of up in this area, I think. So we'll see how it goes. There are 3 bolts holding that pump on. They're all accessible through those holes, so just find them, get them out. And in this case we're going to try and lift this pump up and put it over here without spilling it. We'll see how that works. Alright, we've got the 3 bolts to the power steering pump loose. Go ahead and try and lift it up here. Get it up a ways. It sounded just a little bit too good to be true that I was going to be able to lift this pump up and out of here without disconnecting the hoses. The trouble I'm having right now is I'm hanging up on this fuel rail Schrader valve here. It's hitting this hose here. This hose does just have a simple clamp on it, so I can take that hose off pretty easy, and hopefully that'll give me the room to clear it. And we'll see if I eventually have to take off that screwed connection, the high pressure hose. First I'm going to drain some of the oil out of there in case I get carried away and tip this over. Taking that low pressure hose off of there seemed to give me the room that I needed. Just remember, when you put this back in, you're going to have to feed it through the serpentine belt just like that. So, even with the high pressure side hose connected, I was able to set it up here on the strut tower. Guess it doesn't hurt anything up there, we'll see. If it gets in the way, we'll just go ahead and take that high pressure hose connection off either here or at the pump. But now you can see down inside, if you ever had to change your cam position sensor, that's it right there. Goes to that cable that we unhooked a while ago up in here. We're getting down to the point now where we're going to have to drain the antifreeze so that we can start taking loose some tubes like that and get this metal hose that runs around here out of the way. You have to take it loose down here. We're getting to the point now where we can't do too much more until we drain the antifreeze, so we can get this pipe out of the way, get this one loose here, and then prepare for taking the intake manifolds off. So we need to have it drained down below that level. You could do that one of several ways. Of course, the radiator should have some kind of a petcock on it. You could drain it that way. I don't particularly like to use those because, one, they're either plugged or they break. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change my mind, move the toboggan to the other side of the vehicle, and we'll get down in here and we'll pull off the lower radiator hose. That'll guarantee us that we get the fluid level down below the intake manifolds here. Wouldn't want to pull that off and get a big slosh of antifreeze down inside the engine. Not too bad. Pulled the hose partially off. We'll just let that drain for a while. Antifreeze is drained down. Go ahead and tighten down that lower radiator hose, just one less thing to forget. Antifreeze is drained, so now we can go ahead and loosen this. Take that pipe off. There's this pipe here, one bolt down there. I think there's a connector in this area. There's one in underneath there. That pipe goes on down, gets lost way down in there, and goes to, I believe, the heater core. I'm hoping I don't have to take that loose down there. Hopefully I can just get this pipe loose and out of the way. This hose here is original equipment, so we're going to replace that. I'll show you the part number for that. This fitting here on the thermostat housing was pretty tight. So if you take the tube loose from this end, you can slide your boxed end wrench over here. That's a 13 millimeter. Get a 15 millimeter on the nut below it, crack it loose. Took just a couple of wraps on a chisel to get this piece to come loose. Got that pipe loose. Here where that nut was, that was a slot there. It does look like there's enough flexibility. We'll probably be able to get this valve cover off without having to mess around with trying to chase this down into the deep dark dungeons and mess with one of them crazy clamps. At this point we could pull the upper intake manifold / plenum off, but I think I'm going to test my theory and try and take this valve cover off now. Took just a little wiggle and jiggle and that valve cover did come up out of there. Much to my surprise, it is filled with snot. I didn't know that the problem was this serious, but apparently it's good that I'm getting to this right away. One other tidbit, these valve cover bolts, they kind of stay in there. They won't come all the way out. We could take the back valve cover off now, but I'm going to wait. I'm kind of anxious to see what's under this top intake manifold plenum here. Before you take it off, just kind of note where some of the brackets, studs, that kind of thing are. Should be able to just unscrew them, lift them all up in one piece, but just take note of those things. Couple of love taps with the back end of a wood hammer, loosen it right up. Notice it did lift straight up and off of that EGR tube there. At this point you want to be careful. You've got these ports open. Anything that goes down in there could go into the cylinders. In case, little pieces of gasket, that kind of stuff. Be more worried about bolts, etc. In most of the videos I've seen at this point, they take out these two bolts here and they pop these fuel injectors out of there. But as I look at this thing, I'm like, I don't see why you have to do that. It appears to me that could all stay in there, and I'm not into doing any extra work I don't have to. I did buy the O-rings to go over those fuel injectors just because I thought I had to, but at this point I might not do that. We do have a couple challenges over on this driver's side. There are the fuel lines. There appears to be a nut here that hopefully will break loose fairly easily, and a nut here, and then the fuel line should disengage. There is a bracket right here. It appears to be connected to the head. I don't think it'll be an issue, but if it does have to come off, that's not a big deal. I can feel the nut or the bolt down underneath it. Right now my biggest concern is this particular heater hose fitting here that comes off of the where behind the thermostat here. From what I've heard, this is a quick disconnect fitting. I don't really see how that's going to come apart. I was able to follow that metal tube down and close back in here to the firewall. I can see where it does go to a rubber hose, so that's going to be my go-to fix, is to try and get that hose off there, and then maybe after I have this hose off I can get this whole thing to just come on up and out of there and not have to disconnect that fitting there. One other thing we're going to do while we have this thing off and apart is we're going to change this thermostat, because man, is it a bear to change this thing. if you don't have this thing torn apart like this. The bolt back here is pretty much completely blocked by all this exhaust shielding and everything, so good time to replace the thermostat. This fitting here on the fuel rail came loose, no big deal. This one here came loose without too much trouble. Just right here, I go ahead and take this bolt loose. It's going to let these fuel lines move a little bit, help you to get this fuel lines off and eventually the intake manifold off. Alright, dealing with the fuel rail on this side, this one was a little difficult, but it popped out and snapped. This one over here is really being a bear to me. I mean, I have been pulling and pulling and it will not come out of there. Okay, I got it. I ended up spraying a little penetrating oil in here and then just wiggling and pulling, and it finally came out. So that was a little harder than I thought. Okay, I just got lucky. I noticed that little O-ring sitting there. Obviously at one time that was on that fitting. If that would have fallen down inside of there, I would have put it back together without it and it would have been not good. There I put the O-ring seal back on the fuel line. Hopefully the gasket kit came with a new one. This one seems to fit pretty loosely on there, but that's got to be where it was. This thing over here, I don't see anything there. I'm hoping that's more of a compression type fitting. We'll see. I'm going to go ahead and take this bracket off in hopes that it'll give me a little better access to this quick disconnect here, and maybe I can get this heater tube to pull out. With that bracket out of the way, you've got a lot better access. Now, I don't know how these work exactly, but it appears if you squeeze that in, it would allow you to pull this tube out. We'll see if I have any luck. One thing that would be a big help is if you would loosen that nut down there. That would let that pipe slide backwards. Okay, the good news is I got the quick disconnect fitting to come apart. The bad news is I cracked the plastic so it will not snap and lock back in. Let's look at what we've got here. There's a little sleeve. There's a little sleeve that goes on there. There's also a little O-ring gasket behind that. So I don't want to drop this little sleeve here, but the two things you've got there, whoops, I guess that what I thought was an O-ring gasket, that's just the rest of the quick disconnect. So alright, we'll leave that on there for now. But anyway, we'll have a little figuring out to do what we're going to do when we put this back together. After a hiccup with the quick disconnect there on the thermostat housing, we'll go on to moving on now. At least we can get this off. First, we need to take off this back valve cover, and then I think it's just going to be the 6 bolts and that intake manifold to pop up and out of there with the fuel injectors still on. Some good news here. Even though I broke that quick disconnect fitting, apparently I'm not the only person in the world. I was able to find that part, found it on Amazon, then I took that dormant part number and called AutoZone. They had one in stock, so I can go get one. A lot of people say, heck, just take that thing out of there, put a barbed fitting in there, cut that tube off and put a piece of hose in there. Alright, that quick disconnect fitting's in there like a son of a gun, and I've read a couple things online about people snapping those off, so we're going to add a little heat up that thermostat housing, see if we can get it to break loose. Alright, the heat worked like a charm. Got that baby cracked loose. Want to do that now while it's still firmly bolted to the engine. Hopefully that quick disconnect fitting that I'm going to get tomorrow will fit right back in there. Time to take this rear valve cover off. So there's 4 bolts there. To get the bottom bolt on the driver's side, I'm going to have to take out the stud that holds in the coil pack. It's in the way of me getting a straight shot to that bolt. And for some reason they're in tight. Alright, I got that bad boy off of there. That back bolt on the driver's side gave me heck. You definitely want to get a 6-point socket. Get that stud out of the way, make sure you're straight on, and untighten that thing. I don't know why these valve cover bolts were so tight, but they came out hard. Okay, this intake manifold bolt right here, you can't get to it straight on. Maybe if the fuel rail would have been off, I could have. I ended up with a wobbly 1/4 inch up here to a 1/2 inch big ratchet. I was pretty sure I was going to snap that wobbly, but it finally broke loose. 3 of the outer short intake manifold bolts were really hard to come out, but this one here, driver's side back, it was basically loose. Take the 4 long bolts out. I cracked them already, they were pretty loose. I'm using a 1/4 inch drive socket. It just fits down there better between the fuel rail. Alright. One final step is remove that upper radiator hose from the thermostat housing there. Didn't take any tapping with a hammer or anything, just grabbed right in here and pulled that baby up. So let's get that lifted up and off of there. Got that lifted off of there. Now just for fun, trying to see if we can spot anything that might be the culprit. Right down in here, the orange is missing from the bottom half leading down to the flat surface. The silicone stayed with the intake manifold. This side looks a little better. Here's the back side, passenger. Here's the back side, front. Hard to say what may have caused the failure. I'll just mention at this point I did pay somebody to do this job, a mechanic at a shop. It's probably been about 9 years ago and about 45,000 miles ago. So these might be the better gaskets than the factory stuff, but didn't hold up either. There's the lower intake manifold. Fuel injector is still on there. Didn't need to disconnect those. I'm kind of a firm believer and don't fix it if it ain't broke and induce some kind of failure. There's both valve covers. They're going to need some heavy cleaning. I guess the good news is that inside the engine here is not full of that yellow snot. The next step is to back out the nuts on those rocker arms so you can get the push rods out. We'll see if we can just back them out enough that the push rod will slip out without taking it all the way off. That'll probably work on some of them where the spring is all the way up, in other words the valve's closed. If the valve's open, that may not work. If we do end up taking the rocker arms completely off and the push rods all the way out, which push rods are coming out, we'll want to keep them organized such that they all go back in exactly the same spot and ideally the same direction. Whatever's on top now should be on top now. I wanted to give you a little feel for how tight these rocker arm nuts are. In this case I've got the rocker arm nuts. There are some styles that have a bolt. This has your basic nut, and then underneath it is a little half circle that it rocks on. They're not real tight. Now eventually they're going to tell you to torque these down to not very tight and then go another 30 degrees. But we'll get to that when it happens. What I'm going to try and do is back these nuts out till they're just about to come off of the studs, and then see if I can't slip the push rod out of there. That way I don't have to take these rocker arms off and keep track of them. The strategy of just loosening up these nuts here just far enough to get the push rod out, that worked fine. Didn't have to take any rocker arms completely off. Some of these, when you untighten them, you'll notice the spring starts to decompress. That valve was open. We'll get into this later, but some of the videos they show when you go to tighten these things back down, they bring each one of them to top dead center so that both valves are completely closed, spring is completely uncompressed. Then do the tightening. As far as I'm concerned, just take it down, you'll feel it. It's going to be compressing that spring, and then bang, you'll come up against a hard stop. This is a non-adjustable type valve set, so there's no messing around like I used to back in the 70s and 80s, where basically you got everything to top dead center, you tightened it down until you could just felt some tension on the push rod, and then you gave it about a half to 3/4 of a turn more just to compress the lifter a little bit. But that's not the case on this non-adjustable. So the nut comes down, hits a hard stop. I threw together just a real quick little jig here to hold the push rods. I've seen another video where they just take a 1-gallon antifreeze jug and just jam a big Phillips screwdriver in there. That'll work. All the push rods are in the little jig. Downside down, upsides up. So we'll get them back in exactly the same way. The next step is to remove the intake manifold gaskets. Scrape the surfaces. Get these two end pieces scraped free of any silicone. Get everything nice and cleaned up. Maybe use a little acetone after you've got everything cleaned up to kind of dry the surfaces. And we'll go from there. So let's get to scraping. Once you get all the big chunks taken off with a putty knife, I like to just come in here. This is some 400 grit sandpaper. Just work it around in here and smooth out everything. I'm done scraping, done working with my 400 grit sandpaper, paying special attention to these ports here. Those are the ones that typically are going to leak on you. These outside ones, you only got one bolt around them. The good news is at this point all your intake valves are fully closed, so before you put anything back together you're going to want to take a flashlight, look down in there, make sure you didn't get any little shavings from the gasket material, that kind of stuff in there. We'll eventually need these gaskets. Don't mess around, get the Fel-Pro. There's the part number. May not end up using these O-rings for the fuel rail injectors, but if you need them, that's the part number there. And then I've got a can of this spray a gasket sealant, high tack. That's used to kind of hold the gaskets into the valve covers while you're putting them on. Probably also use just a little bit on the intake manifold to hold them in place. At some point you're going to want to take your valve covers and clean them out, so take them over to your solvent tank. Oh, whoops, I guess in this case, kitchen sink while your wife's away, for those bleachable moments. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to replace this thermostat while we've got this off. I'm not going to show that. We've got these valve covers fairly clean. We'll do a little scraping of gasket here on this lower intake manifold, and then we'll do some scraping of gaskets on the upper intake manifold, or plenum. Here's what you get in your kit. You get the valve cover gaskets, some gaskets for the EGR,
tube and EGR valve itself. Intake manifold gaskets. On these they say use no sealer, so I'll have to trust them. Then you get a little tube of sealer, some upper intake manifold plenum gaskets, and then in here there is some O-rings for, I think this is for the thermostat, and then one of these is for like if you want to pull that, what used to be a distributor, if you want to pull that out and put that on there, you can do that. And then after that, I'm not sure what that other one's for. The new valve cover gaskets fit in there pretty tight. There's little nubs all the way around that kind of squeeze into the slot. So there's really no need for any of the spray adhesive to hold that in place. Got the intake manifold off now. Down inside that fuel injector rail, the big one, you can see what it looks like in there. Over on the other side, that's a little bit harder to get a shot of, but it appears that down inside there is a little seal, and that remained. I will show a quick shot of the thermostat here. There is this gasket that came with the set, so we're going to pop this thing out of here, replace it. There's that quick disconnect. We're going to put a new one on. One other thing I noticed, I had undone this sensor early on. Appears that was not necessary. This is probably the coolant temperature sensor, so you could leave that connected. The new thermostat does come with that rubber gasket. Here's the Duralast part number. I've been scraping the gasket off of the lower intake manifold and cleaning up kind of underneath here, kind of that gunk. Paying special attention to these coolant ports here. You want to get those good and clean, free of all gasket material. Take that 400 grit sandpaper, polish them. One other tidbit, if you're like me and you're not going to take that fuel rail off and pull the injectors out, these 4 long bolts won't come out. Not a big deal, except you're supposed to put some Loctite on there before you put them back in. Again, not a big deal. Just get them good and clean now. Right before you put them on, lube them with Loctite, you'll be fine. They make it pretty idiot proof. There's a little metal pin there that pops into the cylinder head, so you won't get these on backwards. Lettering side out. Forget what I said earlier about these pieces here on this quick disconnect heater core line. I thought there was actually 2 pieces, like some kind of a little sleeve and then some other piece. Actually, that was just 2 broken pieces of the plastic quick disconnect. There's quite a bit of good news here. AutoZone actually sells this little piece. It's the 800, it's hard to see there, 800-401 part number. Again, that's AutoZone. But the even better news is they just sell the plain little plastic clip. That's the part number there. One of these is the size you need. If you notice that heater core pipe has a rib around the back there, this little plastic fitting is going to fit over the tube, and eventually when you push it in, you're going to push it in far enough that that rib drops into that groove right there under my thumbnail, and at that point it'll be locked in there. And then these little fish hooks, they're gripped into the outer fitting and holding it all together. Okay, I'm getting ready to put this thing back together. I wanted to check on the push rods. Since this thing has been apart once, I just want to make sure the mechanic got them back in the right spot, because some push rods are longer than the others. The exhaust push rods are the longer ones. The intake are the shorter ones. Here's the way they line up with the rocker arms. It's kind of a funny pattern. Exhaust, intake, intake, exhaust. We've got the intake manifold gaskets in place. We've got the push rods all back in their proper locations. Again,
Exhaust ones are longer than intake. Be very careful about that. Now you want to go ahead and just tighten these down till you feel them hit the stop. This one I'm tightening right now. I can see the valve is compressing, but when I hit the stop, it's pretty obvious that I hit the stop. So don't worry about getting it to top dead center. You're going to know when you hit the stop on these things. This is another one where it's compressing the valve. It's not taking any effort at all. And then bang, it hits a stop. So okay, there you're basically at zero. From there we're going to torque them. The manual says since these have the nuts, they get torqued to, it says 18 foot-pounds. I'm going with 20. If these would have had the bolts, that's the one where you tighten it to like 5 foot-pounds and then you give it another 30-degree turn. Doesn't apply here. We've got the nuts. So we hit the stop and we give it about 20 foot-pounds. They're set. Even 20 foot-pounds doesn't seem like very much. That's a pretty good sized stud. I'm not worried about it. So I bumped it up to 25 foot-pounds. Get these all torqued down. Move on to the next step. The next step is to apply about a 1/8 inch tall bead of RTV silicone along the flat valley parts on each side, each end. Make sure you get underneath the intake manifold gasket on that. Next I'm going to coat the 4 long center bolts on the lower intake manifold with some thread lock. This is semi-permanent. Those bolts don't get tightened hardly at all, just 115 inch-pounds, so you need a little something to keep them going tight. Alright, now we're going to carefully set this lower intake manifold into place. That all looks good, and I can see a little bit of RTV squeezing out. So I think we're good. Now there is a torquing sequence for this. Basically it's like tightening a tire. We're going to use that little 1/4 inch socket because it fits down in here better, but we're basically going to tighten these in a star pattern. There is a torquing sequence, but you know, basically it's a star pattern. Again, it says just to 115 inch-pounds. Doesn't seem like much to me, but we don't want to crush that Fel-Pro gasket, so we'll just do what they say. Took just a little bit of wiggling to get these 4 top bolts to drop into their threads down below. And then we'll just get them cinched up, and then we'll work on the torque. We've also got the 4 lower bolts. We'll get some thread lock on those, get those things started and cinched down. As I tighten those top 4 bolts, I could kind of, as I'd get one kind of tight, I'd go back to the other side and it'd be loose again. So it just kind of kept working around in a bit of a star pattern. I could see the RTV starting to squish out a little bit more. Hopefully these Fel-Pros have got that kind of that rubber that's sticking up, and that's kind of smashing down and conforming there. So we've got those snugged up. Get those 4 smaller ones in. Alright, 115 inch-pounds, I'm going with 120. Kind of tightening in a star pattern here. Alright, those end ones, I've got them pretty snug. I'm going to do the best I can. A couple of them you really can't get a torque wrench in there, but we'll get them snug down. I'm going to start shortcutting some steps now. What I'll do is at the end of this video, I'll provide you a step-by-step procedure. You could do some screenshots of it if you want. One thing though, when you put these valve cover gaskets back on, there's this one little niche. Put just a little bit of RTV silicone in that little notch. We're going to replace a short piece of hose that goes from here to here. It's a Gates 19026. Getting ready to reinstall that quick disconnect. Since I was able to get that new plastic locking ring, no reason not to reuse this one. Went ahead and cleaned it out on the inside. There is a rubber, like an O-ring in there for sealing. It was kind of full of some junk. Going to go ahead and clean that out, get some thread sealer on it, get it screwed back in there, then we'll pop it together. Kind of surprised the Felpro gasket does not fit on the EGR valve, so luckily this one looks in pretty good shape that was still on there, so we're going to reuse it. Well, we're in the home stretch. We've got some accelerator cables to put back on, power steering pump, alternator, motor mount, little tiny hose there, fill it with antifreeze, that kind of stuff. It's hard to take the time to number everything, but boy, it's sure fun when you find a connector and it's got a number on it. And all you have to do is match up the number. You just get that feeling of satisfaction. When you're putting the power steering pump in, first note where the holes are at. You're going to be putting those bolts through these holes. You're not going to be able to see where you're at, so you're going to be kind of putting them in there blind and having to rotate this a little bit. One little trick is to use a 6-point socket and pack this baby full of grease, and it'll hold those bolts a little bit better for you so they don't fall out and get down in here somewhere. To get the alternator in there, we're going to have to take this nut off this bolt, slide the bolt out, get it to straddle that mounting thing there, get the bolt back in it, put the nut on, then there's 2 brackets that go on up here. Before we put that baby into place though, we want to connect at least that electrical connector down there, because it's hard to get to. It ends up down on the bottom. This top one you can get to. We've got the alternator in, put the motor mount back in place. Now we're going to try and get the holes down in there to line up with the motor mount. The engine has shifted back a little bit. Wasn't like it crashed into the fan or anything, but it has definitely shifted back. I've done this before when I had to replace a serpentine belt, so I had jury rigged up a hook up in my ceiling. Now we've got to come along here, and I'm going to use that to kind of reposition the engine and get these holes down here to line up. Just a little bit of leverage back in behind there to move it around, and then you can use some kind of a pin or something to go down in here as your kind of alignment tool. Get them to line up, pull them in. Don't forget to refill the power steering fluid. You're also going to want to, I left this little tube off here, got this little bleeder open. We're going to add some antifreeze as well. As I said earlier, I'll provide these step-by-step instructions so you can screenshot them later. Basically what I did was, as I took it apart step by step, I recorded it on video, went in and edited it, and then after I got it edited, I sat there and opened up a spreadsheet, wrote it down step by step, and then sorted it in descending order and flipped it around for the install. Crazy as it seems, I was checking my list and I had forgot to tighten that one bolt right there, so it really helps to have a checklist. The accelerator and cruise control cables are much easier to put on than they are to take off. I noticed when I took it apart, my accelerator cable is frayed a little bit. Most likely you're going to see a video of me replacing that here one of these days. Yay! Woo! It's running! Yay! Woo! It's running! I'm sure some of you heard that squeak. I got in a little bit of a hurry, didn't check alignment, but I didn't quite get that serpentine belt over the power steering pump. So we'll just loosen that up, pull it over. Should make that squeak go away. Alright, that's better. We're going to keep checking for fuel leaks, any kind of leaks for a little while. We still got to put this cover back on here. And then of course the tire. And we should be ready to rock and roll. Just in time for winter weather. It's time to wrap it up. If you've got one of these vehicles, I feel your pain. I've had this thing for almost 20 years, but it gets me around for cheap.